For more on the president's actions in the face of this crisis, I want to bring in Democratic Congressman Max Rose of New York. And Congressman, obviously New York has been hit particularly hard by this, and I personally know a lot of folks who have been hit by this in the city. I'm sure many of your constituents have. It does seem to me that this, what your colleague Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Chuck Schumer have called for, this just seems like a very obvious and simple thing the government should be doing here.
You're absolutely right. Look, FEMA, and it's not often acknowledged, is an incredibly flexible vehicle by which the federal government can reimburse states to execute and address a whole host of things that happens in a natural disaster. About a month ago, I wrote a letter to FEMA calling on them to basically follow up on these requests for individual assistance. FEMA can also reimburse for unemployment assistance. FEMA can reimburse for housing, and certainly FEMA can reimburse for funeral costs. So this begs the question, why aren't they doing it? I mean, they didn't even respond to my letter, so why aren't they doing it? One can only imagine that they're not doing it because they don't know what the costs will be. They're worried about managerial expenses or this or that. Well, then come back to us. Tell Congress what you need, because I am certain, at least I hope, that they are not okay with New Yorkers or any other Americans dying and then being left in the street. They can't be okay with this. So tell us what you need, and I promise you, we will give it to you. And if we don't, then you will see me very loudly turning on Democrats or Republicans that won't fund you accordingly.
You and I have spoken before about your experience in Afghanistan when you served in the armed forces, and about experience with loss in that context. And I'm just curious your thoughts. I mean, it strikes me right now that there is a kind of absence from the top, particularly, of any expression of collective grief, collective mourning, collective honor, frankly, for people. And compassion and empathy for people that have struggled through this at this moment when we are facing this. It really is essentially unprecedented situation.
Look, we need moral leadership right now. We need the President of the United States to be not only the commander-in-chief, but the uniter-in-chief, and someone who we can see express the incredible grief that we are all feeling. There is not one New Yorker who hasn't in some way, shape, or form experienced this crisis in truly and utterly tragic ways. And beyond that, and this is one of the evils of this crisis, we are forced to grieve within the confines of our own home. We can't even go through the normal traditions associated with losing a loved one. And especially right now, we need our leader to actually say something about that. We need the president to say something about that. That is, in my mind, just as important as allocating these resources that we just referred to.
I want to ask you about a scene that played out today, not in New York, in the state of Michigan, not dissimilar from scenes we've seen in other state capitals. A relatively small group of people, quite unrepresentative of national political and public opinion, given all the polling we've seen, and quite marginal, but a striking scene. These were protesters in Michigan, which it is their American right, of course, to freely assemble, but armed to the teeth, sometimes banging on doors, yelling at guards inside the Michigan State House, obviously not physically distancing at all. What do you make of protest with weapons like that in an American State House?
Those are scary images. I say that as someone who spends a good portion of my time in Congress considering this issue of domestic terrorism and the rise of a far-right organized movement that is actually global in nature, often connected to people who have significant military training and weapons training and who are equipped accordingly. But we have to note this, okay? We are seeing numbers right now in New York that are starting slowly, not fast enough, slowly to go down. And that wasn't inevitable. Okay, it's not like the projections were wrong. No, we changed the reality of the projections, and we did that by all of us banding together and changing our social behavior. And we're not out of the woods yet. We will all, there will continue to be a deep interdependence to this crisis. So, of course, we have to note the economic pain that people are going to. It would be naive and even cold to just disregard that. But with that being said, though, we can't just forget about the reality of this virus, which is that if we disregard the advice of medical professionals, then we will go right back to where we were, seeing an ungodly surge of new positive cases and death.
I'm curious, actually. You're interestingly situated here, both politically and geographically. I mean, you represent Staten Island, parts of Brooklyn. You're in a district that was previously held by a Republican. It's a district that voted for Trump in 2016. I am curious to hear what do your constituents think about all this? This is not a liberal district necessarily at all. No. It's also a district that is seeing firsthand the effects of this. What do you hear from the folks that you represent?
Look, it's not a liberal district. It's not a conservative district. It's a patriotic district. And what I hear from people in my community is very simple. This is not the time to play games. This is not the time to be unnecessarily divisive. This is a time when we have to assume an attitude that one would assume during total war, which is to address the threat at hand and utilize all the resources that we have to save people's lives, because people's lives are absolutely on the line. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't hold people accountable. That doesn't mean that you don't exercise oversight. That's my job, and that certainly doesn't mean that you don't call someone out when they tell New Yorkers to drop dead, as Mitch McConnell and now his lackey Rick Scott recently have. I have no problem, and they have no problem, openly saying that that is wrong. It's ignorant, it's naive, it's cold, and it's economically stupid. But what they do not want to see is anyone getting in the way of us saving lives, getting in the way of putting people back safely to work. And that's what they deserve.
Yeah. Congressman Max Rose, thank you so much for making some time tonight.
Thanks again.